Hi, I'm Mr. Kufs. I teach advanced placement SUNY United States history, and I'm making a video about the steps leading up to the American Civil War. So our time frame is basically going to be 1848 to 1861. So if you want to get that reference in your mind, now's the time to start. So in 1848, the Mexican War ended, and through the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, we acquired a great deal of land in the West that encompassed a bunch of states like today, Arizona and New Mexico, and parts of Utah and Nevada and all of California. Following that acquisition, there was fear from a lot of northern congressmen that slavery would expand into those territories because the Missouri Compromise in 1820 had drawn an artificial 36-30 line for all territory that in the West, and anything below it, in theory, could have slaves. So immediately, a Pennsylvania congressman named David Wilmot came up with the Wilmot Proviso. Never actually passed, but the Wilmot Proviso essentially was going to ban slavery in that area. It really opens up a wound in the South because the Southern congressmen started seeing that there was potential that they were going to lose their power and lose their slaves effectively because they would lose their power in Congress, particularly in the Senate, where the balance had been pretty much the same since 1820. So what happens is a year later, around that time frame, gold is discovered in California, and California quickly is flooded with people, mostly people, almost all without slaves, looking for fortune and looking to mine for gold. So in 1850, California wants to enter the Union as a state, and it's a state that's very lucrative, and Congress obviously wants to have this state in complete manifest destiny. The issue is, however, that it's a state that would be a free state. It rests on both sides of this artificial line, and it would disrupt the balance. So those same three players that have been in Congress for now almost 40 years, Henry Clay representing the West, and then John C. Calhoun representing the South, and Daniel Webster representing the North, are still very influential voices in Congress, each of them with their own opinions. And Henry Clay, the great compromiser, has one more great compromise trick up his sleeve, and that is to usher California into the Union as a free state, and then have other provisions like a strict enforcement of the Federal Fugitive Slave Act, like assumption of Texas's debt, and a few other smaller pieces in attempt with legislation to try to do what they do in Congress, which is, put a little bit of this in to help and this in to help, and essentially it ends up with a bunch of favors to different congressmen to get the legislation through. It fails. And as a side note, Clay, Calhoun, and Webster all die within 2 years of this failure in 1850. A young senator from Illinois named Stephen Douglas takes the legislation from Henry Clay and has a little bit more influence at this point because he's younger and he's built some better relationships, and he ends up getting it passed item by item. So California does enter as a free state. All the other things happen as well, and it seems like on the surface it's an excellent compromise, but essentially California's entrance as a free state ultimately tips the balance. So now the Senate, in addition to the House of Representatives, really favor the non-slave states. So for the South, the writing is becoming on the wall, for lack of a better phrase, and they can see that maybe this whole union that they entered might have been a bad idea because they're going to lose states' rights, and by virtue of doing that, they're going to lose the institution of slavery, which because of cotton has become more valuable than ever before. In the next coming years, a book comes out called Uncle Tom's Cabin. It's written by a woman from the North, and that's important to note. Her name's Harriet Beecher Stowe. She had never actually been to the South, but she'd been south enough where she was near the border of Kentucky and Ohio and had conversations with people that were aware of what went on in slavery. So she wrote a scathing critique of a life, fictional, although based on her conversations, of slavery in the South. It was wide read throughout really all of the states. And in the South, they were furious at her because they looked at it like, who's this lady? She's never been here. How dare she say this about us? In the North, the impact was immeasurable. Queen Victoria, as far as England, wept when she read it. Eventually, 10 years later, President Lincoln, when introduced, would say jokingly, although hurt her feelings, why, if it isn't the little lady who started this big war. So that is a very important step if we're building up to war, is Uncle Tom's Cabin and its impact. Flash forward a few years later, and you've got the territory of what essentially will be Kansas and Nebraska, the Nebraska Territory. They break it into two, and here's Stephen Douglas again. He's going to allow popular sovereignty, or the will of the people, to decide the slavery issue in this territory, which on surface sounds, hey, that's great, we're going to let democracy reign. Well, Nebraska's a shoo-in to be free, so there's the balance upset there. But Kansas becomes a hotbed of violence. They call it Bleeding Kansas, because Kansas is a place where everybody that's for slavery or against slavery and has any bit of clout is traveling there trying to influence a vote. So Kansas becomes, some people say the Civil War started in Kansas in the mid-1850s, 5 or 6 years before the actual Civil War. At this point, the Whig Party, WHIG, is becoming very divided, and the Republican Party, a brand new party with one goal, one platform piece, which is to stop the extension of slavery into the West, is starting to pick up momentum. And it will be this new Republican Party that essentially becomes the other major party against the Democrats. And it will be that party that in 1860, when Abraham Lincoln is elected, ultimately leads to the southern states feeling like, listen, this is it. We can't be a part of this country anymore. They just elected a guy whose one platform of his party is to stop slavery in the West, which means we're going to lose all our power. So at that point, this Republican Party is gaining congressional momentum, and they will be a viable party by 1860. 1856, you're starting to see violence even in the halls of the Senate. There's violence with a man's beaten with a cane, Charles Sumner, and it ends up that you can't, guys are bringing guns and pistols into the Senate. 1857, there's a Supreme Court case about Roger B. Taney makes a decision. He's a holdover from Andrew Jackson, so a very pro-slave court at this point makes a decision about a slave, Dred Scott, who lived free for a decade, that ultimately says, hey, I don't care if you're free, if you're a slave, you're always a slave, and he's quoted as saying that no black man deserves any rights that a white man has. 1858, the slavery issue takes a turn in the state of Illinois congressional race for Senate. The very popular Stephen Douglas, the guy that's been the guy with the Compromise 1850 and the Kansas-Nebraska Act, is running against a relative unknown, a guy that was kind of a lifetime loser, Abraham Lincoln. They debate, and through these debates, Douglas issues the Freeport Doctrine, and Lincoln issues a statement on slavery expansion, comes up with a lot of profound statements that run in our nation's newspapers. Lincoln loses the 1858 Senate race, but he gains a little bit of a reputation that'll help him be a second or third choice when the Republican Party's looking for maybe a more moderate candidate and not a radical abolitionist like William Seward from Auburn to be the choice as the Republican nominee to challenge Douglas for the presidency. So those two will meet again. In 1859, a man named John Brown, along with his sons, a man who had hacked up a few people at Powhatan Creek during the whole Kansas-Nebraska Act and Bleeding Kansas, decides that he is going to be a one-man wrecking ball. And he's going to go to Harper's Ferry, Virginia, and he and his sons are going to wake the slaves up, and he's going to give them weapons, and they're going to take over the town, and they're going to storm into this town, and they're going to kill the southern slave owners, and grab more slaves and kill more slave owners, and then go to the next southern town, and he's going to wipe out slavery with an army of 1 million slaves. The plan fails. A free black is the first person to die. A few of his sons died, and John Brown himself was captured and eventually hanged. But it was clear at this point that John Brown was going to be sort of a martyr in the North, because he represented this mindset that we have to stop this evil institution of slavery. Frederick Douglass, a famous abolitionist of the era, said that John Brown, to him, was all Frederick Douglass said is, I just write with the pen. John Brown is the guy that actually is out there fighting with the sword. And so there's a respect for Brown from some, there's a disdain from others. The Southerners loathe him. A lot of people, like Lincoln, that are more moderate, see him as, that was a despicable act. You can't just go murder people in their beds. But ultimately, it opens up a larger wound that leads to this 1860 presidential election, where Lincoln triumphs and South Carolina begins essentially a whole collection of states that leave the Union. A congressman named John Crittenden tries a last-minute compromise to try to hold the Union together, and it flops. And when Lincoln takes office, he's got this crisis on his hands that ultimately at Fort Sumter shots would be fired in April of 1861, and the American Civil War will last for 4 years, 4 horrible years. It'll be the bloodiest conflict in American history. There'll be over 600,000 lost lives, more than every other war combined.